In the last session of Theology and Religion with J.D. Reiner, we discussed the canonical sources that refer to Jesus' burial. That is, the places within the New Testament that talk about how Joseph entombed Jesus. Those sources were 1 Corinthians and the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Today, we will cover three of the earliest sources from outside the New Testament, which are the Gospel of Peter, the secret book of James, and the Epistula Apostolorum. Some of the information that I use here comes from the website earlychristianwritings.com, which is a very useful resource created by a biblical scholar named Peter Kirby. As before, we will read and discuss each document separately and then comment on their historical and theological significance. You do not have to read or listen to the last post to make sense of this one, but if you want to examine the sources about Jesus' burial in chronological order, then you should start with the New Testament sources because they are the oldest, in which case I would recommend you go to the previous post. Now, I hope that you will join me as we examine these fascinating ancient documents. Our first source, the Gospel of Peter, might be the earliest apocryphal gospel, especially if we do not consider the Gospel of Thomas. It could have been written from the late 1st century to the middle of the 2nd century. Because of its comparatively early date and its contents, most experts believe that it contains traditions independent of the four Gospels in the New Testament, although, of course, the Gospel of Peter may or may not have been aware of the canonical Gospels. The narration is from the Apostle Peter's perspective, although experts universally reject Petrine authorship. The passage that narrates Jesus' burial is the following. And they drew out the nails from the hands of the Lord, and placed him on the earth. And all the earth was shaken, and a great fear came about. Then the sun shone, and it was found to be the 9th hour. And the Jews rejoiced, and gave his body to Joseph, that he might bury it, since he was the one who had seen the many good things he did. And having taken the Lord, he washed and tied him with a linen cloth, and brought him into his own sepulchre, called the garden of Joseph. So, what does the Gospel of Peter tell us compared to the canonical Gospels? It agrees with the Gospel of John that the tomb in which Joseph buried Jesus was in a garden. But it adds that the garden was called the Garden of Joseph, which is not a detail that appears in any other source. Peter also agrees with Matthew that the tomb belongs to Joseph. Earlier in the Gospel, Peter refers to Joseph as a friend of both Pilate and Jesus, which indicates a closer relationship to each character than the canonical Gospels imply, which either just call Joseph a righteous council member or a disciple of Jesus, or a secret disciple of Jesus. We will now analyze the secret book of James, otherwise known as the Apocryphon of James. Critical historians usually place its time of writing between 100 and 150 CE, that is, within the first half of the 2nd century. Like the Gospel of Peter, this book claims apostolic authorship. The writer claims to be James, the brother of Jesus himself, writing the original autograph in Hebrew. And like Peter's Gospel, scholars deny that the historical James actually wrote it. This especially makes sense because some of the book exhibits semi-Gnostic themes, which would be hard to associate with a simple 1st century Galilean like James. Even though the author claims Hebrew as the original language, the texts that exist are Coptic translations from Greek. The passage that talks about Jesus' burial occurs in James' account of a post-resurrection appearance of Jesus, who comes to bring secret teachings to Peter and James, but not to the other disciples. It goes like this. The Lord answered and said, What is your merit, if you do the will of the Father, and it is not given to you from him as a gift while you are tempted by Satan? But if you are oppressed by Satan and persecuted and you do his will, I say that he will love you, and make you equal with me, and reckon you to have become beloved through his providence by your own choice. So will you not cease loving the flesh and being afraid of sufferings? Or do you not know that you have yet to be abused and to be accused unjustly? and have yet to be shut up in prison, and condemned unlawfully, and crucified without reason, and buried shamefully, as was I myself, by the evil one? Do you dare to spare the flesh, you for whom the Spirit is an encircling wall? If you consider how long the world existed before you, and how long it will exist after you, you will find that your life is one single day, and your sufferings one single hour. For the good will not enter into the world. Scorn death, therefore, and take thought for life. Remember my cross and my death, and you will live. As you can see, the secret book of James only mentions the burial passively, somewhat like Paul when he repeats the creedal formulation in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. However, James includes some details that Paul and the other Gospels do not discuss. For instance, James explicitly states that Jesus was buried shamefully, which is a fact that other Christian sources appear to downplay. Along with that, James places the responsibility for the crucifixion and burial on the evil one. In early Christian literature, that phrase generally refers to Satan, and James almost certainly means the same thing because he mentions Satan by name earlier in the passage. Our last early non-canonical source for Jesus' burial is the Epistula Apostolorum, or the Letter of the Apostles. Historians believe that the date of composition for this text is the middle of the 2nd century, and it survives in both Coptic and Ethiopic versions. The main point of the text is to combat Gnostic theology using proto-Orthodox arguments, which is why this text does not exhibit docetic or Gnostic tendencies like our other two sources do that we've been looking at. The part of the text that talks about Jesus' entombment is the following. I'm going to start mid-sentence here because the earlier sentence wasn't quite relevant. Concerning whom we testify that the Lord is he who was crucified by Pontius Pilate and Archelaus between the two thieves, and with him he was taken down from the tree of the cross, and was buried in a place which is called the place of a skull. And thither went 3 women, Mary, she that was kin to Martha, and Mary Magdalene, and took ointments to pour upon the body, weeping and mourning over that which was come to pass. And when they drew near to the sepulchre, they looked in and found not the body. They found the stone and rolled away and opened the entrance. This text essentially agrees with the canonical Gospels regarding how Jesus was buried. The letter does take time to mention that the burial place was in the place of a skull, the same spot where the crucifixion took place. Overall, this source has more details than the secret book of James and the Apostle Paul, but fewer details than the Gospel of Peter, or the Synoptic Gospels, or the Gospel of John. We have now examined the 3 earliest non-canonical sources for Jesus' burial. So, what is their significance for the academic study of religion? Just like the canonical Gospels, historians can use these sources in order to reconstruct a historical view of Jesus' burial. For example, historians who suspect that Jesus' burial was a dishonorable one will find evidence for that view in the secret book of James. This is because secret James is an early source that calls Jesus' burial shameful. Of course, the argument does not stand or fall on this single word, but it can be combined with other evidence to argue for that historical scenario. And in fact, I published a paper not too long ago about the burial of Jesus, arguing that it was indeed shameful. And if I had stumbled across the secret book of James and what it says here, I think that I would have included his account in with my research in my paper, because I think he gives an important piece of evidence for arguing for the shameful burial of Jesus. But anyway, at least we're talking about it now. So let's talk about the theological significance of these sources. Because the Gospel of Peter, the secret book of James, and the Epistula Apostolorum are non-canonical texts, they are not considered authoritative scripture by Orthodox Christians. But does this mean that they are not theologically useful in the Christian understanding of Jesus' burial? In my view, that is not necessarily the case. Certainly, they do not provide authoritative traditions that the Church can use for doctrine. But they give Christians a glimpse into what heterodox views were developing in the early Christian communities. By understanding what the Church does not teach definitively about Jesus' burial, we can understand better what the Church does teach definitively. I hope that you enjoyed this post on the non-canonical sources for Jesus' burial. If you are watching this on YouTube, then I invite you to click the like, subscribe, and notification buttons to receive future content. For more information about me and my work, visit jdreiner.com. To get in touch, you can reach me at jonathandreiner@gmail.com. Donations are always appreciated, and links are provided both on my website and video descriptions. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you on the next post.